The first thing you'll do in Photoshop is either open a file or create a new file. So let's go over how to do both. When you launch the latest version of Photoshop CC, you may see a start screen that looks something like this. If you wanted to open an existing image, you could go to the Open button on the start screen and click, or if you wanted to create a new image from scratch, you could use the New button on the start screen. But there's another way to get to these same commands from anywhere in Photoshop. So even if your start screen isn't showing, you can always go up to the File menu at the top of Photoshop and choose New or Open from there. Let's go ahead and choose Open from the File menu to open some existing image files into Photoshop. That will launch your Mac Finder or your Windows File Explorer, where you'll navigate through your file system to an image file and select it. You could select one of the practice files that come with this tutorial, as I'm doing, or you can select an image of your own. If you want to open more than one image at a time, hold the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on Windows and select another image file. Then click the Open button. Both selected images open into Photoshop's editing workspace, which is called the Document window. At the top of the Document window, there is a tab for each open image, and the tab tells you the name of the image. If you want to see another open image, just click its tab. So that's how to open existing images. Let's leave those open and talk about how to create a new image from scratch. You might do that when you want a blank canvas on which to draw or on which you want to place some images. So this time, from the File menu, let's choose New. That opens this new document window. Photoshop comes with a lot of blank document presets that you can start with. To find one that works for you, first select a category of documents from the top of the window: Photo, Print, Art and Illustration, or one of these others. I'm going to select Photo. Next, choose one of the preset sizes in this section called Blank Document Presets. If you don't see one you like, there's an option here to view more presets. View all presets. I'm going to select this preset, the Landscape Orientation 4x6. Over on the right, all the details have now been set up for me, including the width and the height. If you decide that's not exactly the size you want, you can type a different size into the width or height fields. Any of the other settings on the right could be customized too, but sticking with the presets takes the worry out of having to figure out technical details at the beginning. And these settings could be changed later in Photoshop if you need to. So to finish creating a new document, click the Create button. And your new blank document opens in Photoshop, ready for you to add a photo, text, or maybe a shape, all as you'll learn to do as you continue through this tutorial series. Let's take a look at how Photoshop is laid out to help you get comfortable with your workspace. To follow along with this tutorial, you can open any image. The first interface element to get familiar with is the document window, which is right here in the center of the screen. This is where you'll work on your images. Over to the right of the document window are the panels that have a variety of image editing controls. There are more panels than just those you see in this panel column. Some of the panels are hidden behind others. For example, here we have a panel group of the Color panel and the Swatches panel. If I want to see the Swatches panel, I can just click its tab, and that brings it forward so I can use it. I'll go ahead and select a blue swatch here in the Swatches panel, and that color will be applied when I use other color features like the brush tool. There are some panels that aren't open on the face of Photoshop. To open one of those panels, go up to the Window menu and choose from this list of alphabetical panels a panel that doesn't have a check mark. For example, I'll choose the Histogram panel. That opens the Histogram panel, and after I'm done using it to evaluate the tones in a photograph, for example, I can close it by clicking the double-pointed arrow here. Another important interface element is the Tools panel, which is located to the left of the document window. It's this long vertical bar here. If you're not sure what a tool is, you can just hover over its icon, and in a moment you'll see the name of the tool in a tooltip. To select a tool, just click it. There are more tools than you see on the face of the Tools panel. You can click and hold any tool, like the horizontal type tool here, that has a little triangle at its bottom right corner. And you'll see a flyout menu of related tools. So if I want to add text not in a horizontal orientation, but rather in a vertical orientation, I can just slide down to the vertical type tool in this flyout menu and select it from there. Each tool has a number of controls called options, and those are found in the next major interface element, the horizontal options bar up here at the top of the screen. The important thing about the options bar is that it changes depending on what tool is selected. So because I have the vertical type tool selected, I see options for text, like this font size menu here. But keep your eye on the options bar as I select another tool. I'll click on the brush tool, for example. And now the options have changed to offer brush opacity and brush flow and more. Let's go ahead and apply an option. One of the things you'll often want to do when you have a brush tool selected is to change the size of the brush tip. And you can do that using the brush picker option, which is the first option over here on the left of this options bar. I'll click that option to open the brush picker, and then I can move the size slider in the brush picker over to the right to increase the size of the brush tip, or to the left to decrease it. And then I'll click in a blank area to close the brush picker. I'll move into the image and I'll apply some paint. And by the way, the brush tool is painting with blue because you'll remember that's the color I chose in the swatches panel earlier in this video. By the way, if I change my mind about that paint stroke or whatever I just did in Photoshop, I can undo it by pressing the common keyboard shortcut for undo, which is Command+Z on a Mac or Control+Z on a PC. The last major interface element is the menu bar at the very top of the screen. And here you have multiple menus with lots of controls. For example, if I want to close this image, I can select Close from the File menu. And you can go ahead and close the image without saving since we haven't made any permanent changes. So that was a quick look at the major features of the Photoshop interface that you'll use over and over as you work in Photoshop. The document window, the panels, the tools, the tool options, and the menu bar. Zooming and panning are ways to navigate around an image that you'll use often as you work on images in Photoshop. To practice working with the zoom and pan controls, open this image from the tutorial practice files, or open a large image of your own. Zooming means changing the magnification of the image, as you might do if you were looking at the sky through a telescope. You may want to zoom in for a closer view of part of an image, or you may want to zoom out to see more of an image on your screen. The most straightforward way to zoom is to select the Zoom tool toward the bottom of the Tools panel here. Then go up to the Options bar for the Zoom tool, where you'll find a plus icon for zooming in and a minus icon for zooming out. Let's start with the plus icon activated, which is the default. Then to zoom in, move into the image and click. And each time you click, you'll zoom in a little further. To zoom back out to see more of the image again, go back to the Options bar and this time select the minus icon, and then click several times in the image to zoom back out. If you want to zoom in again, you have to go back to the Options bar, click the plus icon, and click in the image to zoom in again. Now you may get tired of going up to the Options bar every time you want to switch between zooming in and zooming out, so here's a shortcut that will help you. When the zoom in option is active, as it is now, you can switch to zooming out by holding the Option key on your keyboard if you're on a Mac, or the Alt key on Windows. Hold down that key and then click in the image, and that will automatically switch you back to zooming out. Then release your finger from the Option or Alt key, and you're switched back to zooming in, and so you can click in the image to zoom in again. The Zoom tool has a couple of options in its options bar that you can use to move quickly to zoom levels that you use often. The Fit Screen option here in the options bar comes in handy when you're zoomed in like this and you want to get back to a view of the entire image. Just click the Fit Screen option, and the entire image fits itself into your document window. Another useful option is this 100% option. Clicking this zooms you into 100% view of the image, which is the best way to view an image when you're checking it for sharpness. Now I'm working on a small screen and this image is pretty large, so when I zoom into 100%, I can't see the whole image on my screen, although you may not experience the same thing if you're working on a large monitor. So if I want to see a different part of this image at this zoom level, I'm going to need to move the image around in my document window. That's called panning, and it's done with another tool, the hand tool. So I'm going to go back to the Tools panel, and I'm going to select the hand tool there, which is just above the zoom tool. Then I'll move into the image, and notice that my cursor is now changed to a hand icon. I'll click, drag, and move the image in the document window to a place that I want to see, and then I'll release my mouse. When I'm done checking the sharpness here, and I want to go back to view the entire image on screen, I'll go up to the options bar for the hand tool, and there I'll see the same fit screen option that we had for the zoom tool. So I can just click fit screen in the hand tool options bar, and that takes me back to see the entire image in my document window. Let me show you another way to zoom. Instead of clicking, you can do continuous zoom by holding your mouse down on the image. I'll go back and get the zoom tool in the Tools panel, and then I'm going to click and hold in the image. And the image zooms in continuously. If you zoom in really far like this, you can see the pixels that are the building blocks of an image in Photoshop. By the way, the size of these pixels can affect the image quality of a print, which is why image resolution is an important topic, especially for printing, something we'll talk more about when we cover resizing an image later in this series. I'm going to go up to the options bar and click Fit Screen so I can see the entire image on my screen again. One more thing. Let's say that you're working with another tool, maybe the brush tool, and you're painting in a small area, and you don't want to switch out of the brush tool over to the zoom tool just to zoom. Well, there's a shortcut that you can use instead of the zoom tool, and that is to hold the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC as you press the plus key on your keyboard. And every time you do that, that will zoom you in. If you want to zoom back out, hold the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC and press the minus key on your keyboard. And that will zoom you back out. So that's an introduction to zooming and panning that I hope will help you to navigate your images as you're working on them in Photoshop. To finish up with this lesson, you can close this image without saving. Photoshop gives you lots of flexibility to change the edits that you make. In this video, we'll explore how to undo, redo, and step back in time as you're editing. You can follow along with this file from the practice files for this tutorial or an image of your own. Let's start by making some paint strokes on this image. Select the brush tool in the Tools panel. Then go over to the Swatches panel and click on a color there. You can use any color that you like. Move into the image and make a brush stroke. By the way, if your brush tip isn't big enough, go up to the options bar for the brush tool. Click on the brush picker and set the size there. I'll click off of that picker to close it. Let's make a couple more strokes. Go to the Swatches panel again, select another color, and stroke. And let's do that one more time. So let's say that you want to get rid of the last action that you did in Photoshop, in this case, making that pink stroke. The quick way to do that is to use a keyboard shortcut, Command plus Z on the Mac or Control plus Z on Windows, which I'll do now. And the pink stroke goes away. I can bring it back by pressing Command plus Z again or Control plus Z again. So that keyboard shortcut is a toggle for undoing and redoing the last action that you took. If you prefer to use a menu command rather than the shortcut, you can go up to the Edit menu, and there you can choose Undo, and Photoshop even tells you what action you're going to undo. And then Edit and Redo. Now, what if you want to undo more than just one step? In that case, go up to the Edit menu, and this time choose Step Backward. And you can do that up to 50 times by default. And each time, you're stepping back one action, one step in time. Similarly, you can step forward one step at a time. Edit, step forward. Edit, step forward. Edit, step forward. There's one more way that you can step through time in Photoshop, and that's using the History panel. The History panel is located here in this collapsed column of panels. If you don't see it, go up to the Window menu and choose History. I'm going to expand this panel by moving down to its bottom bar until I see a double-pointed arrow and then dragging down. So what we see in this panel is a separate bar for each action that I just took on this image. Open, and then 3 strokes with the brush tool. Keep your eye on the panel as I make another stroke. My 4th stroke was just recorded in the History panel too. Now let's use another tool to see how it's recorded. Go to the Tools panel, and this time select the Dodge tool, which is used to make things lighter. The Dodge tool also has a brush tip, just like the brush tool. To make the Dodge tool tip bigger, go up to the options bar for this tool, and there you have a size slider that you can drag. And then click in a blank area to close the brush picker. Now come into the image and let's drag over the leaf a couple times. Each time I release my mouse and then drag again, another Dodge tool state is recorded here in the History panel. The beauty of having these states in the History panel is that you can step back through them one by one, like this, or you can jump to a particular state, like this. And each time you do that, everything in the image changes to the way it looked at that state, at that point in time. You also can step forward or jump forward in time in the History panel, like this. 2 things to keep in mind about the History panel. If you do go back to a previous state, let's go back here, and then you do something else. Let's say I dodge in this area of the image. Keep your eye on the History panel, and you'll see that everything after the state I'd gone back to disappears. It's as if you went back to a fork in the road and took a different path. Everything on the first road beyond the fork disappears. And the second thing to keep in mind is that when you close the image, whether or not you save it, your history disappears. And the next time you open the image, the History panel will be cleared out and will start again with a fresh history. Now, if the History panel isn't your cup of tea, you can rely on the simple commands in the Edit menu instead. Undo for single undos and Step Backward for multiple undos. Either way, you have lots of flexibility to correct any mistakes or try new approaches as you edit an image. Saving is a critical step in Photoshop, so let's see how to do it safely. To start, open this image from the tutorial practice files. Now let's make a change to this file. Let's move this small inset photo to somewhere else in the image. To do that, go to the Tools panel and click on the first tool, the Move tool. And then move into the image, click right on the small bouquet photo, and drag it somewhere else in the image. I'll just put it here. You can put it anywhere you like. By the way, if that didn't work for you, it's probably because you're not on the right layer. We'll learn a lot more about selecting a layer later in the tutorial series, but for now, you can avoid that problem by just going over to the Layers panel and making sure that you have the small bouquet layer highlighted. And then try dragging that bouquet again. Now that we've made a change to the image, let's see what happens if we use the Save command to save the image with that change. I'll go up to the File menu, and I'll choose Save. And what happened is that Photoshop went right ahead and saved over and replaced the last version of this image, in this case, the original file that we started with. And that's something you don't often want to do. So let me show you a safer way to save that doesn't save over the last version. Let's make another change. Again, with your Move tool selected, click on that small bouquet photo and move it somewhere else in the image. I'll put mine down here, but you can put yours anywhere. Go up to the File menu, and this time, don't choose Save. Instead, choose Save As. That opens this Save As dialog, where you can avoid saving over the last version of your file by doing something different, like changing the file name or choosing a different location to which to save the file. By the way, if you're on Windows, this dialog box may look slightly different. It does offer the same options that we'll talk about, but they're just arranged slightly differently. So what I'm going to do to avoid saving over the last version of this image is to give this version a new name. I'll go to the Save As field here. That's the file name field if you're on Windows. And I'll click just to the right of the name before the .psd extension, and I'm going to type -v2 for version 2. Now if I were to come down and click Save, although I'm not going to do that just yet, I'd end up with two files, the last saved version of the file and this changed version. So that's a simple way to protect your last saved version, which is sometimes your original, of an image. Before we do click Save, let's take a look at another important thing in this Save As dialog. That's the Format menu here on a Mac. It's called the Save As Type menu on Windows. It's a good idea to save your files in the native Photoshop format, which gives them a .psd extension while you're working on them. To do that, choose Photoshop from this drop-down menu, and if you have layers in your file, as we do, make sure that the Layers box is checked. The big advantage of saving as a PSD is that it will preserve any layers or other editable Photoshop features that you may have added to the image so that you can come back and work with those again later. But you can't see a .psd file on the web. And if you're sharing it with someone who doesn't have Photoshop, they might not be able to open a .psd file, a Photoshop file. So if you want to share an image that you've worked on in Photoshop, I suggest you save another copy of it in addition to the .psd and save that copy in the JPEG format. The JPEG file could be posted online, it will be smaller to send by email, and it will keep any photos in an image looking good. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to my Format menu, and I'll choose JPEG. And then I'll go down to the bottom right and click Save. That triggers this small window of JPEG options. I suggest you just leave these at their defaults and click OK. Finally, here are a couple bonus tips about saving. First, save often. Don't wait until you're done to save a file you're working on. Second, save early. This is especially important if you've created a new file from scratch with the new command, because until you do save, that file hasn't been permanently saved to your system and could be lost if your computer crashes. Let's talk about how to change the size of an image in Photoshop. I suggest that you start with this image from the downloadable practice files for this tutorial. I'd like to set the size of this image so that it's a good fit for posting to a particular website, where I happen to know that the ideal image size is 900 pixels wide. Before we resize this image, let's check how big it is to start with. In most cases, you'll want to start with an image that's bigger than, or at least not a lot smaller than, the resized image that you need. That's because if you enlarge an image a lot, at some point it can start to look blurry. I'll go down to the status bar at the bottom of the document window, and I'll click and hold on the document size information. In the small window that pops up, we can see that this file is 1800 pixels wide by 1200 pixels high. Since we want to put it in a spot that's only 900 pixels wide on our website, that means we'll be scaling it down. To resize this image, I'll go up to the Image menu, and I'll choose Image Size. That opens the Image Size dialog box. If you like, you can make this window bigger by going to the bottom right corner and dragging out. Over on the left, you can see a preview of the image, and on the right are the controls for changing image size. There's a lot of information here, but you don't have to work through all of it, particularly when you're resizing an image that will be viewed on a screen as opposed to print, as we are in this example. So there are just a couple of things to check here. First, make sure that this link icon is on. This is what it looks like when it's on. If I click it, this is what it looks like when it's off. So we want it on to make sure that the width is linked to the height, so that when we resize the image, the original proportion of width to height is preserved, and the image doesn't look squeezed or stretched. Second, make sure that there's a check mark in this box, the Resample box. When this box is checked, you're telling Photoshop that it's okay to throw away some pixels when it makes this image smaller, or if you were making the image bigger, to add some pixels. And third, take a look over to the right of the width and height fields, where you can see the unit of measurement that's being used to report the dimensions of the image. By default, this is set to inches. But when you're sizing an image for use on screen, as we're doing in this example, the correct unit of measurement is not inches, it's pixels. So I'm going to click on either of these two menus and change it from inches to pixels, and the other menu changes too because the width and height are linked. Now it's time to change the size. I'll go to the width field, and instead of 1800, I'll type 900. You can see that the height field automatically changed, and it changed proportionately. Now here's a bonus tip. If you wanted an image to have different proportions, say 900 by 400 rather than 900 by 600 in this case, the best way to achieve that would be to use another tool, the crop tool, which we're going to cover in another movie. Before I click OK, you may be wondering why I didn't change the resolution field. That's because this resolution field is only relevant when you're preparing an image for print. When you're sizing an image for on-screen use, as in this example, the number in this field really doesn't affect the dimensions of the image. So you can leave it set to whatever it happens to be. So after making those few changes in the image size dialog, we can now come down to the OK button and click there to close the image size dialog box and take us back to the document window. If you like, you can go back to the status bar and check the size of the resized image. I'll click and hold on the information there, and you can see that we now have a 900 by 600 pixel image instead of the original, which was 1800 by 1200. All that's left to do is to save the image. I'll go up to the File menu, and I'm going to choose Save As rather than Save because I don't want to save over the original 1800 by 1200 pixel version. So in the Save As dialog, I'm going to give this version another name. You can type anything you want here. I'm going to type Web for my web-sized version of the file. I'll leave everything else as it was, and I'll click Save. I'll click OK in the JPEG Options window, and now we're done. So that's how to resize an image for on-screen use in Photoshop's Image Size dialog box. If you like to print images, it can be useful for you to have a basic understanding of what image resolution means in Photoshop and how to change the resolution of an image to prepare it for print. That's done in the Image Size dialog box. If you're following along, let's open this image that you'll find in the practice files for this tutorial, and then go up to the Image menu and choose Image Size. In the Image Size dialog box, you can see the dimensions of this image reported in pixels. When an image is still on your computer, that's how we measure its size in pixels. But if we were to print this image, we would measure the size of the print in inches, not pixels. Down here in the resolution field, you can see the resolution that's currently set for this image. It's 100. There's nothing special about a resolution of 100, it's just a round number that I picked when I set up the file for this lesson. Now, what does resolution mean here? Well, if you read across this line from left to right, you may get a sense of it. This is telling us that resolution is a particular number of pixels per inch. In this case, 100 pixels per inch. Another way to say that is that if and when you print this image, 100 pixels out of the total 1800 across and the total 1200 down will be assigned to every printed inch horizontally and vertically. Now, if you don't like math problems, you can skip the next part, but if you like to think of this in terms of math, here's a simple example. So the math problem is divide 1800 by 100 and you get 18. That means that at a resolution of 100 pixels per inch, this file will print at 18 inches across. And it works the same way vertically. If we divide the total 1200 pixels of height into groups of 100, that gives you 12 groups or 12 inches. So the height of the printed image will be 12 inches. So if you understand that basic concept, now you're probably wondering, well, what's the best number to put in the resolution field when you're preparing an image for print? Unfortunately, there's no one answer because that depends on what printer you're using. But assuming you're printing at home on a typical inkjet printer, it's fair to say that a resolution of about 300 pixels per inch will do. If I were to print the image with only 100 pixels per inch, it might look okay, but if you got really close to it, it wouldn't look its best, because my desktop inkjet printer really needs around 300 pixels per inch. So how do you go about changing the resolution of a printed image to 300 pixels per inch in this dialog box? The first step is to make sure that the Resample box is unchecked. because if we're just changing the resolution, we probably don't want to change the total number of pixels in the file, and that's what resample does. So let's say that we want the total number of pixels in the file to remain at 1800 by 1200. We just want to reallocate them into groups of 300 rather than groups of 100. So what I'm going to do is type 300 in the resolution field. Spoiler alert, when I do that, the number of inches in the width and height fields will change too. So let's go ahead and type 300 here. And sure enough, the width and height have changed from 18 inches and 12 inches to 6 inches by 4 inches. And that's the size at which this image will print with the necessary resolution to make the best print. I'm done here, so I'm going to click OK. That closes the image size dialog box and takes me back out to the document window. And here I have an image ready to save and print at 6 inches by 4 inches with 300 pixels in every inch. The crop tool is one of Photoshop's most useful tools, particularly for those of you who take lots of photographs. You can use it to improve a composition and to straighten crooked photos. I've opened this photo from the practice files for this tutorial, so I can show you the basics of the crop tool. I'll start by selecting the crop tool here in the Tools panel. As soon as I do, you can see this border around the whole image. That's the crop box. I'll move my cursor over any of the corners or any of the edges of the crop box and drag to reshape that box. So in this case, I might drag it way in to create a very different composition than the original photograph. As you create your crop, Photoshop shows you a preview, with the areas to be cropped away shaded in gray. That way, you can evaluate what it is you're about to eliminate before you finalize the crop. Now, before I finalize this crop, I want to go up to the Options bar to show you an important option there, and that is Delete Cropped Pixels. That option is checked by default. I usually like to uncheck that, because when Delete Cropped Pixels is checked, if you finalize the crop and save the image, you'll permanently delete the cropped away pixels. But with this option unchecked, you can bring back the cropped away pixels at any time. Let's give it a try. I'm going to finalize this crop by going over to the big check mark in the Options bar and clicking there. Now there are other ways to finalize a crop, but I like this way because it's very simple. So now you can see the photo with the crop applied. Let's say that I'm doing something else with the image, and then I change my mind about the way I'd cropped it. At any time, I can go back and select the crop tool, and then click on the image again, and all the pixels that I'd cropped away appear back in view, and I can change my crop. This time I might include some of those cropped away pixels. By the way, you may have noticed that there's a grid of vertical and horizontal lines on top of my photo as I use the crop tool. This overlay represents a classic compositional technique known as the rule of thirds. The idea of this technique is that if you place the important content in an image at the intersection of any of these horizontal and vertical lines, you may improve the composition. Let's give it a try with this image. I'm going to place the bouquet right at this intersection by clicking on the image and dragging and placing it here. And then I might reshape the crop boundary a little more, pulling it in tighter on this bouquet. And then I'll click the check mark. Again, I'm going to click on the image with my crop tool to try to fine-tune this crop a little more. I notice that this image is a little crooked, especially down here at the table. One of the things you can do with the crop tool is straighten an image. There are a couple of ways you can do that. You either can move your cursor outside of one of the corners and manually try to drag to straighten the image, and this grid appears that helps you do that. I prefer the automatic method, so I'm going to undo. That's Command-Z on the Mac, Control-Z on the PC. So the image is crooked again, and then I'll go up to the Options bar, and I'm going to use the Automatic Straighten tool. I'll click on that tool to select it in the Options bar for the crop tool. I'll move into the image, and then I'm going to click along the edge of this table, hold my mouse down, and drag a little way further along that edge. Now you don't have to go all the way along the edge. Sometimes just a little bit will do the trick, like this. And Photoshop uses your line as a guide to rotate the image so that the content looks straight. I'm going to fine-tune this crop a little more, maybe bringing up this edge and maybe moving the bouquet over a bit to put it right in the center. And then I'm going to go up to the options bar and click the check mark to finalize my crop. So those are some of the basics of the crop tool. I hope you give these techniques a try to work on your own compositions in Photoshop. There may be times when you want to add to your document canvas, so there's more room to add elements like text or images to your design. You can do that by using the canvas size command, which we'll look at in this lesson. If you're following along, you can use this image from the practice files for this tutorial or an image of your own. To add to the canvas around this image, I'll go up to the Image menu, where there's a canvas size command right below the image size command. Now, just to keep these two straight, the image size command, which we looked at in another video in this tutorial, works differently than the canvas size command. Unlike image size, canvas size doesn't change the size of your actual photos or other artwork or images in a composition. It just lets you add space around those items. So let's select canvas size. And that opens the canvas size dialog. At the top of this dialog, you can see the width and height of this image in inches. And down here, you can add to the width of the canvas or add to the height of the canvas or both. And those fields are set to inches by default also. But when you're preparing an image for online use rather than for print, it makes more sense to change this unit of measurement to pixels, because that's the way we measure and talk about the size of images on screen, as you learned earlier in this tutorial. So I'm going to change either one of these menus from inches to pixels, and the other menu changes too. If you know the total width in pixels that you want the image to be after expanding the canvas, you could type that number here in the width field. But it's often easier to just tell Photoshop how many pixels to add to the canvas without worrying about what the total will be. To do that, come down here and click the Relative checkbox. That sets the number in the width and height fields to 0. And now I can type in the number of pixels that I want to add to the canvas. So let's say that I want to add 400 pixels to the width of the canvas. I'll type 400 here. If I wanted to add to the height of the canvas, I could do that too. I'm just going to leave that at 0 for now. And then I'll click OK to apply that. And out in the document window, you can see that Photoshop added canvas to both the left and the right sides of this photo. What it did was split the 400 pixels of extra width that I asked it for into 200 pixels on the right and 200 pixels over here on the left. Well, what if I wanted to add canvas to just one side of this image? Let's say over here to the right side. That's done slightly differently. So let's undo what we've done so far and try that instead. I'll press Command-Z on the Mac, Control-Z on a PC to undo. And I'll go back to the Image menu and choose Canvas Size again. The first thing I'm going to do here is to check that the width and height fields are still set to pixels. And they're not. They've reverted to the default inches. So again, I'll change those menus to pixels. And I'll double check that Relative is checked. As I said, I want the added canvas to appear just on the right side of this image. To do that, I'll go down to this anchor diagram, and I'm going to click on the middle box on the left side of this diagram. What that does is tell Photoshop to pin or anchor the image to the left side of the canvas and put the extra canvas to its right. So now I'm going to go up to the width field and I'm going to type in the number of pixels that I want to add to the right side of this image. Let's add 800 pixels. And click OK. And that's exactly the effect that I wanted. You probably noticed that so far my canvas extensions have all been white, but you can control the color of your canvas extension here in the Canvas Size dialog using the Canvas Extension Color menu here. By the way, if you're working on another image and you're not on a special background layer, as we are in this image, then your Canvas Extension Color menu will be unavailable, and the canvas that you add will be transparent. It will appear like a gray and white checkerboard in Photoshop. I'm just going to click Cancel, And if I want to save this image, I'll go to the File menu and I'll choose Save As so I don't save over my original. So that's how you can add space to your document canvas so you have some extra room to add more image elements. Layers are the building blocks of any image in Photoshop, so it's important to understand what layers are and why to use them, which we'll cover in this video. If you're following along, open this layered image from the downloadable practice files for this tutorial. You might think of layers like separate flat panes of glass, stacked one on top of the other. Each layer contains separate pieces of content. To get a sense of how layers are constructed, let's take a look at this Layers panel. I've closed my other panels so that we can focus on the Layers panel, but you can skip that. By the way, if your Layers panel isn't showing, go up to the Window menu and choose Layers from there. The Layers panel is where you'll go to select and work with layers. In this image, there are 4 layers, each with separate content. If you click the eye icon to the left of a layer, you can toggle the visibility of that layer off and on. So I'm going to turn off the visibility of the tailor layer and keep your eye on the image so you can see what's on that layer. I'll do the same for the cloth layer and for the pattern layer. You can see that the bottom layer, the background layer, is filled with white because this image started with a new blank image preset with a white background. Let's turn on all the other layers again by clicking in the empty box just to the left of each layer to add the eye icon back in. Now let's take a look at just one layer, the tailor layer. A quick way to turn off all the layers except the tailor layer is to hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on the PC and click on the eye icon to the left of the tailor layer. In the document window, you can see that this layer contains just the one small photo surrounded by a gray and white checkerboard pattern. That pattern represents transparent pixels, which allow us to see down through the corresponding part of this layer to the content of the layers below. So let's turn that content back on by going back to the Layers panel, again holding the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on the PC, and clicking on the eye icon to the left of the tailor layer, and all the other layers and their eye icons come back into view. So again, you might think of layers like a stack of panes of glass, each with its own artwork and in some cases transparent areas that let you see down through to the layers below. The biggest benefit of having items on separate layers like this is that you'll be able to edit pieces of an image independently without affecting the rest of the image. Follow along with this example to see what I mean. Let's say that you wanted to edit or move just the small photo of the cloth being cut. To do that, you'd have to select the layer that contains that photo. Go to the Layers panel and click on the cloth layer, just to the right of the layer name. Now that the cloth layer is selected, any editing you do will affect only that layer. For example, go to the Tools panel and select the Move tool, and then click on the cloth photo and drag, and only that photo moves, because only that layer is selected. And this applies to other kinds of edits too. For example, if you painted on the image or applied a filter, as you'll do later in this tutorial series, those edits would affect only the selected cloth layer and not the rest of the image. By the way, there are some editing activities like moving layers that you can do to more than one layer at a time. And to do that, you need to select more than one layer. Over in the Layers panel, we already have the cloth layer selected. If you don't, click on that layer. To select the tailor layer too, hold down the Command key on a Mac or the Control key on a PC and click on the tailor layer. With both layers selected, you can click and drag either of those photos and they'll move together. Now here's a bonus tip. With the Move tool selected, take a look at its options bar and you'll see this option, Auto Select Layer, is checked. With that option checked, clicking anywhere in the image will automatically select the top layer at that location that contains content. For example, watch the Layers panel as I click over here on the pattern photo, and you'll see that the pattern layer was automatically selected for you in the Layers panel. Sometimes that's really useful, but sometimes it can cause you to inadvertently select a layer that you didn't mean to. To avoid that, you can uncheck Auto Select Layer in the Move tool options bar, and instead select layers manually by clicking on them in the Layers panel, as we did in this tutorial. So to recap, being able to work with selected pieces of content independently is the biggest benefit of using layers. There's lots more to learn about layers, so stay tuned for the rest of this tutorial. Let's take a look at the functions you'll use most often when you're working with layers in the Layers panel. You can follow along with this image from the practice files for this tutorial or with a layered image of your own. Over on the right in the Layers panel, the order in which the layers are stacked from top to bottom controls the front to back arrangement of content in the image. For example, in this image, the tailor layer is above the pattern layer in the Layers panel. And so in the image, the tailor photo with the man in the red hat is on top of the pattern photo where those two photos overlap. Well, what if you wanted the tailor photo here to be behind the pattern photo in the image? In that case, come over to the Layers panel and select the tailor photo by clicking on it. Then click, hold, and drag the tailor layer beneath the pattern layer. Now this can be tricky. You need to wait until you see a double line below the pattern layer and then release your finger from the mouse or the trackpad. And that moves the tailor layer beneath the pattern layer in the Layers panel. And look what happened over in the image. The photo of the tailor is behind the photo of the pattern. Another thing you're probably wondering about is how to create a new layer. Let's say that I want a new empty layer on which I could add pixels, maybe by painting with the brush tool. First, think about where you want to add the layer in the layer stacking order and select the layer just below that. In this example, I'd like to add a new layer above the pattern layer because I want to paint on top of this pattern. So I'll go to the Layers panel and I'll select the pattern layer, and then I'll create my new layer by going to the bottom of the Layers panel and clicking this icon with the turned up page corner. That creates a new layer above the pattern layer. Adding a layer this way creates a pixel-based layer on which you could do things like add color. If you use a different tool like the Type tool or the Shape tool, or if you use the Place Embedded command to add a new photo or another image to a composition, all as we'll do later in this tutorial series, Photoshop will make a new layer for you automatically. So don't be surprised if you see extra layers in your Layers panel when you use any of those functions. When you do make a new layer, it's a good idea to give it a name that's meaningful to you, so it's easier to find later. To rename any layer, double-click right on the layer name and type right over it to enter your own name. I'm going to type Paint and then press Enter or Return on the keyboard. Now let's put this new layer to use by adding some color to it. I'll go up to the Swatches panel. If your Swatches panel isn't open, open it from the Window menu at the top of the screen. In the Swatches panel, I'm going to click on a color. You can use any color you like. And then I'll move over to the Tools panel, where I'll select the Brush tool. I'll go up to the Options bar for the Brush tool, and I'll click on the Brush Picker, where I have a size slider that I can drag to the right to change the size of this brush. And then I'll move into the image, and I'll start to paint, and the Brush Picker closes as I paint on the pattern. Because the paint is on its own layer in the Layers panel, you have lots of flexibility to edit that paint splotch without affecting the rest of the image. As just one example, you could change the opacity of the paint layer. With the paint layer selected, I'll go up to the top of the Layers panel, and I'll click the arrow to the right of Opacity, and then I'll drag the Opacity slider to the left. Keep your eye on the paint splotch as I do this, and you can see that it gets less and less opaque or more transparent. I'll click off of the opacity slider in a blank area to close that slider. That's a simple way to blend the content of two layers together. Finally, what if you decide that you don't want the contents of the new layer at all? You can delete that layer or any layer by selecting it and then pressing the Delete key on a Mac keyboard or the Backspace key on a Windows keyboard. And don't worry, you can undo that by pressing Command+Z on the Mac or Control+Z on a Windows keyboard. And here's a bonus tip. There are even more layer-related commands located in the panel menu, which you can access by clicking this little menu icon at the top right of the Layers panel. So if you ever want to do something else with your layers, like maybe duplicate a layer, take a look in this menu. So that's how to use some of the most common layer functions: changing layer stacking order, creating a new pixel-based layer, changing layer opacity, and deleting a layer. When you're making a multi-layered design, you may need to resize the content of a layer, as opposed to resizing the entire image. To do that, you'll use a transform command. If you're following along, you can use this image from the practice files for this tutorial, or you can use your own multi-layered image. Let's say that we want to make this photo of sewing tools smaller. The first step is to go to the Layers panel and select the layer that contains that photo, which is the Tools Photo layer. I'll click on that layer to select it. Then go up to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform. That puts this border around all the contents of the selected layer. So if there were more artwork on the same layer, all of it would be encompassed within that border and all would be resized together. Now usually you don't want to distort an image as you resize it. To avoid that, hold down the Shift key to constrain proportions as you click on any edge or any corner and drag in to make this photo smaller or out to make it larger. By the way, it's fine to make layer content smaller, but in most cases, it's best not to make pixel-based content, like a photograph, a lot bigger than the original, or it may look blurry. The last step is to accept the change that you made with the transform command. One way to do that is to go up to the options bar and click the big check mark that appears there whenever you use Free Transform. And that's all there is to it. Another thing you can do is to resize the content of more than one layer at a time. This can save you time and can help you to resize multiple images by the same amount. So let's say that we want to make both the sewing tools photo and the photo of the tailor smaller at the same time. They're located on two different layers, so we have to go over to the Layers panel and make sure both of those layers are selected. The Tools Photo layer is already selected. If yours isn't, just click on that layer. To add the Tailor Photo layer to the selection, hold down the Command key on the Mac or the Control key on Windows and click on the Tailor Photo layer. Then, as before, go up to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform. Hold down the Shift key and click on any edge or any corner of the border that surrounds both of the images on both selected layers. Drag inward to make both photos smaller at the same time. And when you're done, go up to the options bar and click the big check mark to accept that change. So that's how to resize layers with Free Transform. Please don't confuse this technique with resizing an entire image, which is done with the Image Size command in the Image menu, as you learned in another tutorial in this series. In this video, you'll learn how to add multiple images to a composition that you're building in Photoshop. Like many things in Photoshop, there's more than one way to do this. We're going to use the Place Embedded method, which automatically creates a new layer for each added image, giving you the flexibility to size and position each added image as you like. If you're following along, start by opening this image from the practice files for this tutorial. You can leave the other practice file with a similar name closed for now. When we use the Place Embedded command to add another image to this composition, Photoshop will automatically create a new layer for the added image, above whichever layer is selected at the moment. So the first step is to go to the Layers panel and select the layer above which you want your new layer. I'm going to select the background layer. Next, go to the File menu and choose Place Embedded. That opens your Finder or File Explorer, where you'll navigate to the file that you want to add. If you're using the downloadable practice files, navigate to the practice files on your computer and choose this file. Then click the Place button at the bottom right. The added photo appears in the open image in your document window. This photo happens to be larger than the open image, but you don't have to worry about that. Photoshop automatically scales the added photo down so it fits in the original image. Before you complete the placement, you'll scale down the photo and place it where you want it in the composition. To scale this photo down proportionately without distorting it, hold the Shift key as you drag from any of the corners inward. If you want your added photo to be about the same size as one of the other small photos in this composition, use one of those photos as a guide to help you size this one. I'll remove my finger from the mouse or trackpad and release the Shift key. I'll hold the Shift key down and come over to this other corner and drag inward there to get the added photo just about the same size as this other small photo. Next, you'll want to position the added photo where you want it in the composition. To do that, click inside of the border and drag. These pink guides may appear, they're called Smart Guides, to help you align the added photo to the other elements in the composition. When you're happy with the size and the placement of your added photo, complete the placement by going up to the options bar and clicking the big check mark there. And that's all there is to it. If later you decide that you want to move the added photo, you can do that by just selecting its layer, getting the Move tool in the Tools panel, and dragging the added photo elsewhere in the composition. Or let's say you want to change the size of the added photo. You can do that too. And to do that, you'll use the free transform command that we learned about in an earlier video in this tutorial. So let's say I wanted that middle image to be a different size. I would make sure its layer is selected in the Layers panel. I'd go up to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform, hold the Shift key to constrain proportions, and drag from any of the corners to change the size of that photo. And then click the check mark in the options bar to commit that change. There's one thing to keep in mind when you use the Place Embedded command, and that is that there are some edits you can't do directly on the resulting smart object that this command creates. Now, there's lots to learn about smart objects, but for now, let's just talk about what to do if you run into this situation. Let's say that I wanted to paint on the photo that I added. I'll make sure I have its layer selected in the Layers panel, and I'll go over to the Tools panel, and I'll select the Brush tool. When I move into the image and click to paint, I get this message saying that this object must be rasterized before proceeding. This means that if I click OK, I'll be converting my added photo layer into a regular pixel-based layer. And that's just fine, so I'll click OK. And that's the simple solution that will allow me to paint on my added photo. So now that you know how to add images to a composition, have fun creating your own unique multi-image designs in Photoshop. Many files have a special background layer. Let's take a look at what a background layer is and how to work with it. If you're following along, use this file from the practice files for this tutorial. Let's take a look at the Layers panel, where at the bottom of this layer stack, there's a layer labeled Background with an uppercase B and a lock symbol. That's how to recognize a special background layer. The content of this background layer is the large photo in the background of the image in the document window. A background layer like this has special properties that are different than a regular layer. For example, you can't change the stacking order of a background layer in the Layers panel. Try to move it up in the layer stack by selecting the background layer and then dragging up. And you just can't drop it on top of these other layers. Instead, you get this no way symbol. And when you remove your finger from the mouse or the trackpad, the background layer pops back down to the bottom of the layer stack. Similarly, you can't drag another layer beneath the background layer in the Layers panel. Try selecting another layer and then drag beneath the background layer and you get that same no way symbol. A background layer just has to be at the bottom of the layer stack, and its content has to be at the back of the image behind the other image elements. Let's go back to the Layers panel and select the background layer again to see something else that you can't do with the background layer, and that is to move it with the Move tool. I'll go over and select the Move tool in the Tools panel. I'll click on that large background photo and I'll try to move, and I just get a message that the Move tool can't move this layer because the layer is locked. I'll click OK to dismiss that. There are a couple other things you can't do with a background layer either. For example, you can't vary the opacity of a layer, and you can't have transparent pixels on a background layer. So what if you want to do any of that with a special background layer? In that case, you need to convert the background layer to a regular layer, and that's as simple as one click. Just come down to the background layer and click on the lock symbol, and it goes away, and that layer becomes a regular layer called Layer 0. And now, because it's a regular layer, I could do all the things I just mentioned that you can't do with a background layer. As just one example, I can move this layer with the Move tool. I have the Move tool still selected. I'll move into the image and I'll drag to the right, And that does move layer 0, and it reveals transparency behind it because this is the bottommost layer in the layer stack. Now, what if you did want to have a special background layer and you didn't have one in your file? Well, you can make any layer into a special background layer by going up to the Layer menu and choosing New Background from Layer. I actually want to make a new layer in this case and make that the background layer. So I'll go down to the bottom of the Layers panel and I'll click the Create New Layer button. That makes a new Layer 1, which I'll drag to the bottom of the layer stack. Layer 1 is currently empty. I'll fill it with white. To do that, I'm going to go up to the Edit menu, and I'll choose Fill. In the Fill dialog that opens, I'll change the first drop-down menu to white, and I'll click OK. And now we have a white layer at the bottom of the layer stack. To change that into a special background layer, I'll go up to the Layer menu and choose New Background from Layer. And now that layer is locked. I can't move it or do the other things that I mentioned. And it's providing a stable base for this composition. So background layers deserve mention because you will run into one sooner rather than later. And now you know what a background layer is, what its limitations are, and how to work with it. When you shoot with a camera or a phone, you don't always get a perfect exposure. A photo may come out too dark or too light, or it may lack contrast and look dull, or it may be too contrasty and have really dark darks and bright brights. The simplest way to correct exposure problems like those is with a brightness contrast adjustment. Let's try it out on this image from the practice files for this tutorial, or on a slightly dark, slightly dull photograph of your own. First, take a quick look at the Layers panel and make sure that you have the layer with the photograph selected. When you are working with photographs, often you'll have only one layer. Then, go up to the Image menu at the top of the screen, and from there, go to the Adjustments category. We're going to try the first adjustment, Brightness Contrast. That opens this Brightness Contrast dialog box, which I've moved over to the side so we can see the image. The fastest way to make a change here is to click the Auto button. That would move the brightness and contrast sliders here to where Photoshop thinks they should be. But if you want more control, you can move the sliders yourself. The brightness slider is sometimes all you need. It controls the overall lightness or darkness of an image. For example, if I drag it to the right, notice that the photo is getting brighter. If I were to go to the left, the photo would be darker. I'm going to take it to the right of where we started, which was 0, brightening up the photo quite a bit. By the way, don't feel that you have to use the same values that I'm using, either in this video or anywhere in this tutorial. The right amount is up to you and your taste. Now sometimes, as I said, increasing or decreasing brightness is all you have to do to improve a dark or light photo. But there's another slider here too, the contrast slider. This slider controls the range of light and dark tones in an image. If you increase contrast, I'll drag the contrast slider way over so you can see what it does. The dark tones in the image get darker and the bright tones get brighter. Too much contrast like this can make it difficult to see detail in the shadow areas, like in these flowers here or over here, and can cause a loss of detail in bright highlight areas, like up here in the background. So that's what high contrast looks like. Let's go to the other extreme and pull this slider all the way to the left. And now you can see what a low contrast image might look like. A little bit flat, a little bit dull. I'm going to put contrast back where I started, at 0, by typing 0 into the value field for the contrast slider. So I think this image could use a little more pop. Therefore, I'm going to drag the contrast slider just slightly to the right, and that will often do the trick. One way to help you evaluate whether your changes have really improved the image is to see a before and after view, and you can do that by clicking the checkbox next to Preview in this dialog. So there's how the image started. And here's how it looks with the increased brightness and contrast that we applied. When you're satisfied, click OK. And that applies your changes directly to the selected layer, in this case to the photograph. If you don't like them, you still have a chance to undo or step backwards, as we learned to do earlier in this series. But just to make sure you can always get back to the original, I suggest that when you save an image you've adjusted like this, you choose Save As rather than Save, and give the file a different name. And then click the Save button. Now, a direct brightness contrast adjustment like the one we used is not the only way to correct exposure problems. Later in this tutorial, we'll learn how to apply an adjustment more flexibly as a re-editable adjustment layer. And there are other ways to tackle exposure too, like levels and curves adjustments that you'll explore as you get more experienced with Photoshop. But the brightness contrast adjustment is a relatively simple solution that can often improve the look of your photos. Adjusting the intensity of color in a photograph can have a big impact. In this video, we'll explore how to do that with a Vibrance adjustment. You can follow along with this image from the practice files for this tutorial. First, whenever you're applying a direct adjustment to an image, you want to make sure that you have the layer selected that contains the image. Here, we just have a single layer in this photograph, so it's not a problem. But if you have a multi-layer image, then you should check the Layers panel first. Now, let's say that we want to make the color of this weaver's sweater richer or more intense. But we don't want her skin to look too saturated. That's a perfect job for a Vibrance adjustment. To apply a Vibrance adjustment, I'll go up to the Image menu, choose Adjustments, and here there are two kinds of adjustments that would affect color intensity. There's Vibrance and there's Hue Saturation. When skin color is involved, or when you need a subtle enhancement to color intensity, then Vibrance is the best choice. We'll cover Hue Saturation and talk about when it's most useful in another video in this tutorial. I'll select Vibrance here, and that opens the Vibrance dialog box. In this dialog box, you have two choices, Saturation or Vibrance. You can use them singly or you can use them together. Let's see what they do. If I drag the Saturation slider over to the right, you'll see right away that the intensity of all the colors is ramped up. Not only does the weaver's sweater become a richer, more intense purple, but the intensity of the flesh tones and of the loom increases too. And it really is too strong an effect in this photo. So I'm going to put saturation back to 0. I'll just type 0 in its value field. Instead, let's try dragging the Vibrance slider to the right. Vibrance does a more subtle job of intensifying color, and it protects the flesh tones from oversaturation. Let's compare a before and after view by clicking the checkbox to the left of Preview. That's how the image looked without the Vibrance adjustment, and here's how it looks with the Vibrance adjustment. We've managed to make the sweater a stronger purple without overdoing the subject's face and the color of the wood. If you're happy with the result, click OK and go to the File menu, choose Save As, and I suggest that you change the file name so you don't save over the original photo with this adjusted version. So that's how to subtly increase color intensity by applying a Vibrance adjustment. We applied this adjustment directly to the photo, but it could be applied as a flexible adjustment layer. That's a topic we'll cover in another video in this tutorial. The Hue Saturation adjustment lets you adjust not only color saturation, but other properties of color too. And it gives you the option to adjust either particular colors or all the colors in an image. So you get more control over color with this adjustment than with the Vibrance adjustment that we looked at earlier in this tutorial. If you're following along, open both these images from the practice files for this tutorial. Let's start with this image of threads on a loom. If it's not showing, click its tab at the top of the document window here. Now go up to the Image menu and choose Adjustments, Hue Saturation. That opens the Hue Saturation dialog box. If it's covering your image, you can click its title bar and drag it out of the way. The dialog box has three main sliders. The Hue slider controls the overall color. So if I drag Hue to the right, I get a different colorway than if I drag it over here to the left. I'll put it back to 0. The Saturation slider controls the intensity of the color. Dragging to the right makes all the colors in the image more intense. Dragging to the left mutes all the colors in the image. I'll put that one back to 0 too, to show you the last slider, Lightness. Dragging this to the left makes all the colors darker. Dragging to the right makes all the colors lighter. I'll put that back to 0 too. When you use the sliders as we just did, they affect all the colors in an image. But the hue saturation adjustment offers something more, the ability to adjust individual colors throughout an image. Let's switch to the other open image to see that. I'm going to click Cancel to close the hue saturation dialog box, and go back to the document window and click on the tab of the other open document. Let's open that dialog box again by going to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation. We've already seen that if I were to move the saturation slider, that would affect the saturation of all the colors in the open image. But let's say that I just want to affect the saturation of the yellows in this image. To do that, I'll go to the menu labeled Master, and I'll choose one of the color ranges from that menu. I'm going to choose yellows. If I drag the saturation slider all the way to the right, you'll see that it's affecting all the yellows throughout the image. Or if I were to go all the way to the left, you can see that I'm lowering the color intensity of all the yellows. Not only the yellow flowers, but also some of the foliage too, because some of that has yellow in it as well. I'd like to lower the color intensity of the yellows just a little, so I'm going to take that saturation slider and I'll put it just about here. You can experiment with changing the hue and the lightness of individual colors too. Now what if I wanted to change the saturation of the orange flowers in the image? If I go up to the menu, I don't see orange there. So rather than just guess at what color range might cover the orange-looking flowers, there's a tool that I can use right here to automatically target whatever the orange is in the flowers and change that color throughout the image. I'll activate this tool by clicking on it, and when there's a dark box around the icon, it's turned on. I'll move into the image and click on the orange in one of these flowers. Keep my mouse held down, and as I drag to the left, I'm lowering the color intensity of the oranges wherever they appear in the image. If I drag to the right, I'm increasing the intensity. And when I do that, you can see that there's some of that orange color, not only in the flowers, but also in the wall, in the vase, and in the table. I'm going to drag just to the left of 0, maybe to about right there. If you look at the hue saturation dialog box, you'll see that dragging in the image with that tool activated has moved the saturation slider, and it's chosen reds as the color range. I'm going to click on that tool to deactivate it, and then I'll click OK to accept all these changes. And finally, I'll go to the File menu, and I'll choose Save As, and I suggest that you change the name of this image so that you don't save over your original with this version. So the hue saturation adjustment gives you lots of options for controlling color in your photos, and it can be applied as a direct adjustment as we just did, or as an adjustment layer, a topic we'll cover next. If you're comfortable applying adjustments directly to an image, you may want to take things a step further by applying similar adjustments in a more flexible way, as adjustment layers. You can use this image from the practice files for this tutorial to follow along. Over in the Layers panel, make sure you have the layer selected above which you want your adjustment layer, keeping in mind that an adjustment layer will affect all layers beneath it by default. I've selected the top layer here, which contains this small photo of a bouquet. Now let's add an adjustment layer. One way to do that is to go to the bottom of the Layers panel and click this icon, the one that looks like a half-black, half-white circle. The menu that pops up contains many of the same adjustments that you can apply as a direct adjustment from the image menu at the top of the screen. But applying them from here as adjustment layers gives you more editing flexibility and protects your original photo from direct changes. I'm going to choose the black and white adjustment layer. That did two things. It automatically created a new layer in the Layers panel above the selected layer, and it opened the Properties panel. The layer that was created is a special kind of layer called an adjustment layer. It doesn't have any image content of its own. Instead, it applies its adjustments to content on the layers below it. So in this case, the content of all layers below this adjustment layer is now black and white in the image. In the Properties panel that opened, you'll find the controls for the adjustment layer. The controls change depending on what kind of adjustment layer is selected at the moment. For a black and white adjustment, you can use these controls to customize the color to black and white conversion. Each of these sliders will lighten or darken areas in the black and white that were a particular color in the color version. For example, to make everything that was yellow in the color image brighter in the black and white, drag the yellows slider to the right. And to make everything that was green in the color image darker in the black and white, drag the green slider to the left. When you're happy with the way things look in the image, close the Properties panel by clicking the double-pointed arrow at the top right. The good news about an adjustment layer is that you can access those controls again anytime and make more changes. To do that, just make sure that the black and white adjustment layer is selected in the Layers panel and click the Properties panel icon again. If you don't see that icon in this collapsed panel, go up to the window menu at the top of the screen and select Properties from there. You could just drag more sliders again, or if you're not sure which of the color range sliders corresponds to which part of the black and white image, let Photoshop figure that out for you by activating this targeting tool and then clicking on something in the image that you want to lighten or darken, like this flower. Drag to the left to darken, or to the right to lighten. Keep in mind that when you do that, you're changing not only the brightness of the object you clicked on, the flower, you're also changing everything that was the same color in the color version of the image. To close the Properties panel, click the double-pointed arrows. Now, an adjustment layer affects everything beneath it in the Layers panel. So you can control what's affected by changing the stacking order of the adjustment layer in the Layers panel. For example, with the adjustment layer selected, click, hold, and drag it beneath the small bouquet layer. And now the small bouquet layer isn't affected by the black and white adjustment, and the small bouquet photo remains in color. When you save an image that has adjustment layers, open the Save As dialog box. Make sure that Layers is checked, and double-check that you're saving in the Photoshop or PSD format. That's important because the Photoshop format retains layers, so your adjustment layers will be there for further editing the next time you open the image, and that isn't true if you save only in the JPEG format. So that's an introduction to adjustment layers. The most important points to remember for now are that using adjustment layers will protect your original images from direct changes and will help you to maximize your editing flexibility. You may have heard of selections, but you may not know exactly what they do. A selection is a way to isolate part of an image so you can make adjustments to that part or work on only that area. Once you've made a selection, only the selected area will be impacted by your edits, whether those involve making an image adjustment, applying a filter, painting, or lots more. In this video, we'll cover some basics about working with selections. You can follow along with this image from the practice files for this tutorial. Let's jump right in and make a selection. We're not focusing on selection tools in this video, so let's just use the first selection tool in the Tools panel, which is the Rectangular Marquee tool. This tool is used to make rectangular and square-shaped selections. Click on that tool, and then move into the image and start at the upper left corner of this building, and click and drag out a rectangular selection of part of the building and include the parking lot below too. The animated lines you see represent the edge of the selection. They're sometimes called marching ants. If you were to do something to the image now, like make an adjustment, it would appear only inside the area defined by the marching ants. Before we do that, take a look at the options bar for this selection tool. There you'll find an icon for adding to a selection, and one for subtracting from a selection. You'll use these often, and you'll find them in the options bar for many of the selection tools. Let's say we want to add to our selection to include the entire building. Click the Add to Selection option in the options bar, and then come into the image and click inside the top right corner of the existing selection and drag to encompass more of the building and the parking lot too. If you don't get it all, you can come in and add to the little bit that you didn't get the first time. Now let's say that you go too far like this. How do you subtract from a selection? For that, go up to the options bar and click on the next icon, the Subtract from Selection icon here. Then come into the image and click and drag around the area that you want to remove from the selection. I'm also going to subtract a little from the selection down here to remove the parking lot. So now that we have the building selected, let's make an adjustment, and you'll see that your adjustment affects just the area inside the marching ants. Let's go up to the Image menu and choose Adjustments, and we'll use a brightness contrast adjustment, which we covered in more detail in an earlier tutorial in this series. In the Brightness Contrast dialog box, drag the brightness slider way over to the left to darken the building, and drag the contrast slider to the right to increase contrast. And click OK. As you can see, that change is affecting only the area inside the marching ants. Let's say you wanted to make a different brightness contrast adjustment to affect everything except the building. In that case, you wouldn't have to start again creating a new selection. Instead, you can invert this selection to select everything except the building. To do that, go up to the Select menu and choose Inverse. With this selection active, let's go to the Image menu and choose Adjustments, Brightness Contrast, and this time let's increase the brightness. And click OK. Finally, when you're finished with a selection, it's important to deselect so that the next thing you do to the image isn't limited by the selection. To do that, go to the Select menu and choose Deselect, or you could use the keyboard shortcut Command+D or Control+D on Windows. It's one to remember because you'll use it often. When you save this image, go to File, Save As, and save it with a different name so you don't save over the original. So those are the basics of selections, but there's lots more to learn about making and working with selections, so stay tuned for the rest of the videos in this tutorial. There are quite a few selection tools and methods. You don't need to master all of them when you're just getting started with Photoshop. Let's get familiar with a couple of selection tools you'll probably use often: the Quick Selection tool and the Lasso tool. You can give them a try on this image from the practice files for this tutorial or on an image of your own. If you're working on an image with multiple layers, first check the Layers panel to make sure the layer with the content you want to select is highlighted there. Go to the Tools panel and click on the Quick Selection tool. This tool can detect edges of objects based on color and tone, so it will do a lot of the selecting work for you. Let's say that we want to select the mannequin so that we can apply an adjustment to it. Click, hold, and drag across part of the mannequin, and Photoshop automatically selects at least part of it, stopping where it sees an edge. Don't worry if you don't get the whole mannequin on the first stroke. As soon as you make the first stroke with this tool, the tool sets itself to the Add to Selection option, so you can just continue to click and drag over other areas that you want to add to the selection. If the tool selects too much, like this area of the background, hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows and click and drag over that area to remove that part from the selection. As soon as you release your finger from the mouse or the trackpad, the Quick Selection tool goes back to the Add to Selection mode, so you can drag over any other areas you want to include in the selection, like this area up here. Alternatively, you could go to the Options bar and click on the plus and minus options there, but it really does make more sense to use the shortcut with this tool. One reason is that you may have to go back and forth a few times, as in this area here where there's not much contrast between the background and the mannequin. So with my finger off the mouse, I'll add to the selection by dragging along this edge, and then I'll hold the Option or Alt key and I'll subtract from the selection. I'll release my finger and I'll add to the selection again. And I might have to subtract one more time. Fortunately, this tool learns as you work, so you may have to give it just a few tries subtracting from and adding to a difficult edge to select it. Another useful tool in a situation like this is the Lasso tool, a selection tool that makes freeform selections. It's located over here in the Tools panel. Go ahead and click on it now. The Lasso tool often comes in handy to manually clean up selections made with another tool. And yes, you can use more than one selection tool to complete a selection. The first thing we need to do is go up to the Options bar for the Lasso tool and switch it from its default to its Add to selection option. Otherwise, if we were to click with this tool at its default setting, we might lose our entire initial selection. If that does happen to you, just use the undo or step backward commands to try to get your selection back. So I'll click on the Add to Selection option, and then I'll move into the image. And here I see a small area that I didn't manage to get with the Quick Selection tool. I'm going to carefully click and drag along the edge, and then around and back to the beginning to include that area in my selection. You can also subtract from a selection with the lasso tool. To do that, go back up to the options bar and click the Subtract from Selection icon. Then I'll move into the image, and here I want to remove this small area, so I'll carefully move along the edge, all the way around, and back to the beginning. So with this selection, I'm going to apply an adjustment. I'll go up to the Image menu, and I'll choose Adjustments and Brightness Contrast. And in the Brightness Contrast dialog box, I'll drag the brightness slider over to the right to brighten just the area that we'd selected, the mannequin. And I'll click OK to accept that. Finally, go to the Select menu and choose Deselect, or use the keyboard shortcut Command+D on the Mac or Control+D on Windows. If you want to save a copy of this image without saving over the original, use the Save As command from the File menu, as we've been doing throughout the tutorial series. So that's an introduction to two very useful selection tools, the Lasso tool and the Quick Selection tool. When you're comfortable making selections, you may want to take things a step further by viewing and fine-tuning a selection in the special Select and Mask workspace. Give it a try with this image from the tutorial practice files. Start by making an initial selection of this jacket. You can do that here in Photoshop's main interface or in the Select and Mask workspace that we'll visit in a minute. We're going to do it here in the main interface using the Quick Selection tool, which you already learned how to do in an earlier video in this tutorial. So click on the Quick Selection tool and then move into the image and click and drag over the jacket on this side and then on this side too. And if your tool selects the area in the middle, hold down the Option key, that's the Alt key on Windows, and click and drag there to remove that area from the selection. I'll release my finger from the mouse, and the tool automatically switches back to Add to Selection mode, and I'll come up to the shoulder and click and drag over this extra bit that I'd missed to add that into the selection too. Now go to the Options bar and click Select and Mask, or go up to the Select menu, and you can choose Select and Mask from here no matter which selection tool you have selected. That opens a separate workspace, the Select and Mask workspace. Start here by going to the right side of the workspace and clicking the View menu icon to open this menu of different ways to view the current selection. Depending on the image you're using, you'll find that different views give you the most accurate information about what could be improved in your initial selection. For example, let's click on this Overlay view. This view is showing us everything that's outside the selection with a transparent red overlay, so we can more clearly see that the initial selection isn't exactly true to the edge of the jacket. There are parts of the jacket that have been left out of the selection. And there's a little bit of the background that's included in the selection that shouldn't be, like this area here on the bottom right. To try to fix that, we'll use one of the tools over here in the Abbreviated Tools panel. Here you'll find some of the same tools as in the main Photoshop interface, and they work the same way here too. For example, there's a Quick Selection tool, a Lasso tool, a Hand tool for panning, and a Zoom tool for zooming. Go ahead and select the third tool from the top. This is a brush tool that lets you simply paint to add to or subtract from the selection. Move into the image and simply paint over an area like this part right here that's covered in red, and as you see, that area becomes clear as I paint over it. I'll do the same up here and over here. Now if I want to remove something from the selection, like down here, I'll go up to the Options bar for this brush tool and click on the minus symbol, and then I'll come over here and I'll paint. Now, as you're painting, you may want to use the zoom tool to zoom in for a closer view. I'm just going to paint like this quickly. I'll go back up to the options bar and I'll switch back to the add to selection, and I'll add in a little bit that I missed right over here. Of course, there are lots of other controls in the Select and Mask workspace, as you can see, and you can explore those as you become more familiar with Photoshop. But this introduction will get you started with basic Select and Mask features like the View menu and a couple of the tools over on the left. Now, before you close the Select and Mask workspace, you need to choose how you'd like to output your improved selection. So go over to the right side, and if you need to, click the scroll bar there and scroll down until you see a menu labeled Output Settings. Click the arrow on that menu. I'm going to scroll down again and choose from the Output To menu, and I'm going to choose to output with the first default option, Selection. And that will tell Photoshop to output the improved selection in the view you're used to, the Marching Ants view. Then click OK to close the Select and Mask workspace and go back to the main interface with the improved selection that appears as marching ants. As you know, anything you do to the image now will affect only the area inside the selection, the jacket. So let's do something we've done in earlier tutorials in this series, add a brightness contrast adjustment. I'll go up to the Image menu, Adjustments, Brightness Contrast, and in the Brightness Contrast dialog box, I'll drag this brightness slider over to the right, brightening the jacket, and then I'll click OK. Finally, I'll deselect by pressing Command plus D on a Mac or Control plus D on Windows. Or you can go to the Select menu and choose Deselect. And if you want a copy of this image with this adjustment without saving over the original, use the Save As command, as we've done throughout this tutorial series. So that's a brief introduction to how to view and fine-tune a selection using just some of the features in the Select and Mask workspace. One of the most magical things you can do in Photoshop is to delete unwanted spots and even objects from an image. In this video, we'll see how quick it is to do that using the Spot Healing Brush tool. If you're following along, download the practice files for this tutorial and open this image. We're going to try to clean up the model's shirt, removing these spots and dabs of paint. You'll be amazed at how well that works, even on a pattern like this striped shirt. Start by zooming in for a closer view. Select the Zoom tool in the Tools panel, and then click a couple of times on the image to zoom in. If you don't see the area of the shirt that you want to work on, get the Hand tool in the Tools panel and click and drag in the image. Now let's select the Spot Healing Brush tool, which is over in the Tools panel right here. Don't confuse this tool with a related tool, the Healing Brush tool. We want the Spot Healing Brush tool. Let's start by removing a spot, like this brown spot here. When you're removing a spot, you want your brush tip to be just a little bigger than the spot. Mine's a bit small, so I'll go up to the options bar for this tool, and I'll click on the brush picker, and I'll drag the size slider over to the right. And then click in a blank area to close the brush picker. Back in the image, to remove that brown spot, I'll just click on it, and poof, it's gone. What's happened is that Photoshop copied a nearby part of the shirt without a spot and used that to cover up the spot, blending the copied content with the area around the spot. Now let's try a smaller spot. Rather than go to the options bar and try to change the brush size, you can change brush size while you're working on an image. To do that, I'll hover over a spot that I want to delete, this tiny blue spot, and then press the left bracket key on the keyboard. The left bracket key is located just to the right of the P key on most keyboards. Each time you press and release the left bracket key, the brush tip gets smaller. And if you were to press the right bracket key, the brush tip would get bigger. So now I'll click on that spot and it's gone. Try removing a few other spots, changing the brush tip on the fly using the left bracket key and the right bracket key each time. Now, spots aren't the only thing you can remove with this tool. You can remove irregular areas like this paint splotch too. To do that, just click and drag over the thing you want to remove, and it's gone. Practice those techniques, clicking on spots and dragging over irregular areas to continue removing the paint from this shirt. If you get a result you don't like, try again with a different size brush. And if you need to move to another area, select the hand tool again and drag. Here you can see how my example looks after just a few minutes working on the shirt with the Spot Healing Brush tool. When you're done, select the Zoom tool again in the Tools panel and go up to the Options bar and click the Fit Screen option to see the whole photo on the screen again. If you're happy with the result, choose File, Save As, and in the Save As dialog box, set the format to Photoshop or PSD, which is the best format for a working copy of an image, as you learned in an earlier tutorial in this series. And then click Save. Now that you know how simple it is to work with the Spot Healing Brush tool, try using it on your own images to remove everything from dust spots to small objects. A fun way to add objects to an image is to use the Clone Stamp tool to copy content from one part of an image and stamp or paint it in wherever you want it. Let's try that on this image from the practice files for this tutorial, using the Clone Stamp tool to fill in some of the sparse areas of this flower arrangement with more flowers. Go to the Tools panel and select the Clone Stamp tool, which is here. Hover over the image to check your brush tip. My brush tip is very small on this large image, so I'm going to go up to the Options bar for the Clone Stamp tool and click the brush picker. And there I'll drag the size slider to the right to make my brush tip bigger. It's also a good idea to increase the hardness of this brush from its default of 0. I'm going to put it way up here. And then click in a blank area to close the brush picker. Now we're going to load the Clone Stamp tool with an object to copy, sort of like you would load a paintbrush with paint. To do that, move down to the bottom right of the image over these flowers, and then hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows. Notice that the brush tip changes to a target icon. Click there, and then release your finger from the Option or Alt key, and the brush tip changes to its normal view. Now move up to an empty area so that you can see that your brush tip is now loaded with those flowers that you just sampled. Click and drag, and you're painting with the flowers. As you do, there's a small cross symbol, a source point, that's moving along with you, sampling more flowers so that you can paint with them using the Clone Stamp tool. Now that you have an idea of how this works, let's try this to fill in the flower arrangement. First, let's undo what we've painted here by pressing Command-Z on the Mac or Control-Z on a PC. And if you need to step back more steps, go up to the Edit menu and use Step Backward. Then, move over the flower arrangement and hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows. The cursor changes to a target, click, and release your finger from the Option or Alt key. And then, move over an area where you need more flowers and start painting. And you can see that the source point is moving along with you, adding more content to this image. If you get a result that you don't like, try loading your brush with different flowers. Hold down the Option or Alt key again somewhere else, and then release your finger and paint over the area that you didn't like. Go ahead and continue the same way on your own, loading your brush tip with flowers and cloning them in to fill out that flower arrangement. If you'd like to see an example, here's an example I've been working on. And here are some tips to help you as you work. As you go, try loading your clone stamp from different areas of the image so you don't get a telltale repeating pattern. And you can also change your brush size as you work to clone smaller or larger areas. Take your time and have fun with this. When you get a result that you like, go up to the File menu, choose Save As, and save your image in the Photoshop or PSD format. And don't forget to try this fun technique on your own images. It's always amazing to see how Photoshop can remove a large object or sometimes even a person from an image. One way to try removing a large object is by filling over it with a special fill command, Content Aware Fill. Let's try it on this image where we can remove this large wooden walkway. The first step is to make a rough selection around the object you want to remove. We'll use the lasso tool, but you could use a different selection tool of your choice, keeping in mind that your selection has to include a little of the background, as you'll see. I'm going to click on the lasso tool in the Tools panel, and then move into the image and draw a selection outside the walkway. Now this is important. You have to include a small bit of the surrounding area inside the selection all the way around. Down at the bottom, I'm going to go outside the document window and all the way around and back to the beginning, and then release my finger from the mouse or trackpad to complete the selection. Now comes the main step. Go up to the Edit menu and choose Fill, and in the Fill dialog box, go to the Contents menu and choose Content Aware. Then just click OK. In just a second, the walkway is gone. Let's deselect by going to the Select menu and choosing Deselect, or using the keyboard shortcut Command+D on Mac, Control+D on Windows. What Photoshop has done is to automatically take some grass from outside of the walkway, use it to cover up the walkway, and then blend the result in with the surrounding area. It really is amazing. Now here's a bonus tip. If you see any blurry areas where the walkway was, you can try using the Clone Stamp tool to cover that area. To do that, go over to the Tools panel and select the Clone Stamp tool, and then go up to its Options bar to the Opacity slider, click there, and drag the Opacity slider to the left to lower the strength or the opacity of the Clone Stamp tool, and then click in a blank area to close that slider. Move into the image and find some grass that isn't blurry. If your brush tip is really small, press the right bracket key on the keyboard, which is near the P key on the keyboard, a couple of times to make the brush tip bigger. Then sample some of the non-blurry grass by holding down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on Windows, so the cursor changes to this target symbol. Click to sample there, and then remove your finger from the Option key or the Alt key. Now move over the area that's a little bit blurry and click and drag to add some texture back in there. If you do like the result, go up to the File menu, choose Save As, and save your image in the Photoshop format. You'll be surprised at how big a change you can make to an image by removing large items. With only a few clicks, you have a whole new image to display or to use as a background for a new design. In this video, we'll go over some basics about Photoshop's brush style tools. If you're following along, open this image from the downloadable practice files for this tutorial. There are a number of tools other than just the brush tool that use brush tips. For example, the Clone Stamp tool, the Eraser tool, the Dodge tool, and more. So even if you don't do illustration in Photoshop, this video is relevant for you. One thing those tools have in common is they have a brush picker in their options bar where you go to choose the brush tip and set its size and hardness for the tool. So let's take a minute to go over what the brush pickers offer. Let's select the brush tool, and then let's go up to the options bar and click on the icon that looks like a brush tip. That opens this window called the brush picker. In the brush picker, you can choose a shape of tool, and there are many to choose from, everything from a leaf shape to a grass shape to a round shape. I'm going to click on one of the round shapes here, and you can vary the size and the hardness of the brush. Let's see what a hard brush looks like. I'll move into the image, and I happen to have a white color swatch selected. You can use any color you like if you're following along. I'm going to click and drag, and as you can see, this brush stroke has a really hard edge. Now if I go back to the brush picker again, and I drag the hardness slider the other way towards soft, and I drag in the image, I get a very different looking effect, a soft-edged brush stroke. You can also change the size of a brush here in the brush picker. In other videos in this series, we introduced the idea that you don't always have to come up to the brush picker to change brush size. It's often more efficient to change brush size as you're working in the image on the fly. If I move into the image and I press the left bracket key, which is the key just to the right of the P key on most keyboards, Each time I press, my brush tip gets smaller by a set percentage. And then I'll click and drag, and you can see that I have a narrow brush stroke. If I want a larger brush stroke, I'll press the right bracket key, which is just to the right of the left bracket key on the keyboard. And each time I press, I get a larger brush stroke, so that when I click and drag, I have a very different looking effect. There are a couple other commonly used brush options to take a look at. One, up here in the options bar, is opacity. If I click on the opacity field and I drag the opacity slider to the left, and then I paint in the image, you can see through the paint to the image below. Next to the opacity field in the options bar is the blend mode field. These various blend modes control how the colors of the paint that the brush applies interact with colors already in the image. This is similar to layer blend modes in the Layers panel, which we'll cover later in this tutorial series. When you're painting with the brush tool on a photograph like this, there's one blend mode you'll find particularly useful, and that's the color blend mode down here. I'm going to select that from the menu, and then I'll go up and I'll change the opacity back to 100%. And I'm going to select another color in the swatches panel, but you can use any color you like. Now when I move into the image and I paint, as you can see, the brush isn't laying down flat paint. Instead, it's applying a color tint to the flower that lets the tonal values of the image show through. And this is very useful for changing the color of objects in photographs. To finish this off, I'm going to go up to the File menu, and I'm going to choose Revert, which takes the image all the way back to the way it looked at the beginning of this video. Let's select the Quick Selection tool in the Tools panel, and then move over the flower and click and drag to quickly select it. Then go back and get the brush tool again, move into the image, and press the right bracket key a few times to make your brush tip big. Then click and drag, and you don't have to be careful about where you're painting, because the selection limits the area where the paint is laid down. Finally, press Command-D on the Mac or Control-D on Windows to deselect. So that's a quick and easy way to change the color of an image in a photograph using the brush tool and the color blend mode. So that's a look at some basics about brush style tools. Brushes and color are topics that go hand in hand. Next, we'll take a deeper look at choosing and using colors. There are a number of tools and features in Photoshop that apply color, everything from the brush tool, to the type tool, to the shape tool, to the fill command under the edit menu, and more. The primary color that most of those use is stored down here at the bottom of the Tools panel, in this box, the foreground color box. There are a number of different ways to set the foreground color, which we'll be looking at later in this tutorial. For now, let's use a simple way, the eyedropper tool, which is located here in the Tools panel. I'll select that tool, and then I'll move into the image and I'll click on a color, like this orange, and that sets the foreground color to orange. So now if I go to the brush tool, or any other tool that applies color, and I use that tool, it makes use of that foreground color. There's a background color box too. Mine happens to be white at the moment. That comes into play less often than the foreground color. For example, the background color is used as a secondary color for the gradient tool, a tool that lets you draw a gradual blend of color from the foreground to the background color. Another use of the background color is just to have another color handy so you can quickly switch to another color when you're doing something like painting. To switch between the foreground and background colors, click the double-pointed bent arrow just above the color boxes. Now I'll go back to the eyedropper tool and I'll click on another color in the image. And that sets the new foreground color. So now I have red as my foreground color and orange as my background color. As I said, I can quickly switch between these two colors either by pressing these double-pointed arrows or using the keyboard shortcut X. Black and white are the default colors. If you ever need to get back to those colors quickly, press D on your keyboard. And the foreground color is now black and the background color white. So that's an introduction to where to store and access colors as you're working with the color tools. Stay tuned for the next video where we'll explore alternative ways to choose colors in Photoshop. Photoshop has a number of different ways to select color, which we'll take a look at in this video. If you're following along, you can use this image from the practice files for this tutorial, or you can use an image of your own. The most full-featured way to select a color is the color picker. To open the color picker, go down to the foreground color box at the bottom of the Tools panel and click there, and the color picker opens, giving you choices for the foreground color. A good place to start in the color picker is with this slider, which by default shows you different hues of color. I'll click and drag this slider to get to the hue I'm interested in, this light blue hue. But hue isn't the only property of color. Saturation and brightness are two other properties, and they're represented here in this large box. So, for example, if I want a dark, desaturated blue, I'll come down to the dark area and over to the left for the desaturated shades of blue, and then I'll click to select a color. Or if I want a bright, very saturated shade of blue, I'll come up here for bright and over to the right for saturated. The color that I choose appears in this square in the New area. The bottom of this square represents the last color that was selected. When I have a color I'm happy with, I'll click OK. And that color appears in the foreground color box at the bottom of the Tools panel. And if I'm working with a tool like the brush tool that applies color, that's the color that it will use. The color picker isn't the only place to go to choose color. We've already seen the eyedropper tool, which you can use to select a color by clicking on it in an image, and this is very useful when you need to match a color to the colors already in an image. There are also two panels over on the right that you can use to choose color, the Swatches panel and the Color panel. If these aren't open, you can open them from the Window menu at the top of the screen. We've been using the Swatches panel throughout this series of tutorials because they're easy to access. The Swatches panel contains preset chips of color. To set a foreground color, all you have to do is click on one of these chips, and it appears down here in the foreground color box. The color chips that you've used most recently appear here at the top of the Swatches panel for easy access. I'm going to click on the Color tab to see the Color panel. The Color panel is a lot like the color picker. Over on the right, it has a color slider that you can use to choose a hue. And then it has a large field where you can choose a shade of that hue according to its brightness from top to bottom and its saturation from right to left. If I select a color here, it appears here in a replica of the foreground color box, and if I go down to the bottom of the Tools panel, I'll find that same color there. And then I can use it with any of my tools, like the brush tool. So that's an overview of the various places to select colors in Photoshop. You're welcome to use whichever of those methods is most convenient and most comfortable for you. By the way, if you don't want to save this image, you're welcome to close it without saving by going up to the File menu and choosing Close. Or you can just click the X here on the Document tab. When you add text to an image in Photoshop, it automatically appears on a special kind of layer called a type layer. Text on a type layer remains editable, so that you can always change its content or its appearance. And it has smooth edges when printed, even if you make the text a lot bigger. In this video, we'll practice adding text to an image. You can use this image from the downloadable practice files for this tutorial, or an image of your own. The tool you'll use most often to create text is the horizontal type tool. You can select it here in the Tools panel. Then go up to the Options bar and click on the Font menu. Here you'll see a list of fonts that you can scroll through to choose one you like. The list shows you a preview of what each font looks like. Or if you know the font that you want, you can just type it here in the font field. I'll type Georgia. And Photoshop shows you all available styles of that font. I'll choose Georgia Bold. If you don't have this font, choose a font of your own. Next, let's set the font size. This menu shows you the font size in points by default. By the way, the default size is very small on a large image like this. If you ever enter type and you can't see it, that's probably why. So just try again with a larger font size. Here you can type in a font size if you know it, or you can click this arrow and choose a font size from the drop-down menu. I'll choose a large font size. Let's use white for the text we're going to enter. To set the font color, go up to the options bar and click the font color field. That opens the color picker, which we covered in an earlier tutorial in this series. To select white here, go to the large field on the left and click on white, and then click OK. If you want to type uppercase letters, as I do, press the caps lock key on your keyboard. Then click in the image and start typing. I'm going to type the name of a fictional tailor business. You can type any name you like. After you enter or edit text, you always have to accept it. One way to do that is to go up to the options bar and click the big check mark there. If the text isn't where you want it, then go to the Tools panel and select the Move tool. Click in the image and drag the text where you want it. Now take a look at the Layers panel. You'll see that Photoshop has created a new layer for you, and it's even named it for you. The T icon on the layer indicates that this is a special re-editable type layer. Now let's say you want another type layer. Using multiple type layers will let you work with and position each one separately, just like regular layers. So let's go back to the Tools panel and select the Horizontal Type tool again. Then move into the image and hold down the Shift key as you click to start a new type layer. That assures that the new text will end up on its own layer rather than tacked on to the end of the first layer, which can happen if you start making one type layer too close to another. Let's choose some different options for this type layer. I'll go up to the Font menu, and this time I'm going to choose a different font and a smaller font size. And then I'll start typing. You can type what you like. At the end of the first line, I'm going to press the Return or the Enter key on the keyboard to add another line of type on the same type layer. When you're finished typing, go up to the options bar and click the big check mark. As long as you still have the type layer selected in the Layers panel, and you still have the Horizontal Type tool selected in the Tools panel, you can change the options for this type layer. For example, if I want the two lines of type on this layer to be center aligned, here in the options bar, I'll click the Center Align icon. Then select the Move tool in the Tools panel and click on the new text and drag it where you want it. And now there's another type layer over in the Layers panel. When you're finished, go to the File menu and choose Save As. In the Save As dialog box, it's important to save in the Photoshop format and to leave layers checked in order to retain your editable type layers in this working version of the file. If you need a copy to share, you can save another copy as a JPEG, but the JPEG won't retain your type layers. So those are the basics of creating text. Stay tuned for the next video where we'll see how to edit text. One of the great things about type layers is that they remain editable, and that's true even after you've saved and closed and reopened a document, as long as you saved it in a format that retains layers, like the Photoshop format. In this video, we'll look at some ways to edit type layers. If you're following along, you can use this image from the practice files for this tutorial, or an image of your own that has type layers. If you want to change all of the text on a type layer the same way, then here's what to do. Go to the Layers panel and select the type layer. Then go over to the Tools panel and select the Type tool. You don't have to highlight all the text on the layer. Now, if you want to make a change, let's say a change to the font size, go up to the Options bar and choose the option that you want. So I'm going to type in a different point size here in the Font Size field. And that affected everything on this type layer. The same is true if you have multiple lines of type on a layer. To see that, let's select this type layer in the Layers panel. We still have the Type tool selected in the Tools panel, so we'll go up to the Options bar and we'll click on the Font Color field. In the color picker, you can choose another color for this text. I'll move the color picker over so that we can see the text. One thing I sometimes like to do in the color picker is check only web colors, and that limits the number of choices, which makes it easier to choose a color. I'm going to choose this color gray, and you can see that that affected all the text on the selected type layer. And then I'll click OK. Now let's say that I've clicked on a regular layer and I'm doing some other work in this image, and then I decide that I want to change just one of the words on this layer. I don't have to bother selecting the type layer that contains these words. All I have to do is select the Type tool in the Tools panel, and then come into the image and click and drag over the portion of that text that I want to change, and that automatically selects the correct type layer in the Layers panel. Now that I have that text selected, I could change any of the options in the options bar, or I can actually change the words of the text. So I'm going to type fine clothing instead of custom clothing. And then I'll go up to the options bar and click the check mark to accept that change. Down at the bottom of this image, we have another kind of text. If I click on that, you can see that a type layer is selected, and on this type layer, there's a text box. This kind of text is called paragraph text. Let me show you quickly how this was made, and then I'll show you how to edit it. I'm going to come up here, and with the Type tool selected, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and click to start a new type layer. And then I'm going to drag. And as you can see, that created a text box. Now you can just type in this box, and the text will wrap when it gets to the edge of the box. Instead of typing, I'm going to go up to the Type menu and choose to paste this dummy text, just so that we have something to see in that box. Now, if I change the shape of the box, you can see that the text rewraps. I'm going to go up to the options bar and click the cancel symbol to delete that in progress type layer. And now let's go down to the actual paragraph text in this image and click on it and reshape the text box to reflow this text. Hold down the Option key on a Mac or the Alt key on Windows as you hover over one of the edges of the text box, and then drag outwards to reflow the text from the center out. Then release your finger from the mouse or trackpad and release your other finger from the Option or Alt key. And I've managed to reflow the text from 3 lines to 2 lines while maintaining the position of the text box in the center of the screen. Now I'll go up to the options bar and click the check mark to accept that change. When you're done editing type layers, you want to be sure to save in a format that retains layers, like the Photoshop format or the PSD format. So that's an introduction to editing type layers in Photoshop. Try these techniques on some of your own images. When you want to make an object that has a geometric shape, like a rectangle or a circle, you could use one of the selection tools and fill it with color. But there's another way to make a shape that gives you more flexibility, and that's to use one of the shape tools. To see how it works, open this image from the practice files for this tutorial. Then, in the Tools panel, go down to the Shape tools, which are located here. Click the Flyout menu to see the different shape tools. I'm going to choose the Rounded Rectangle tool. Using this tool will automatically create a layer in the Layers panel. So go over to the Layers panel and select the layer above which you want your new shape layer. I'll select the background layer. Now come into the image and click and drag to create a shape with rounded corners. Photoshop has made a new layer over in the Layers panel. This is a special kind of layer, a shape layer, that contains smoothed-edged objects that can be resized and reshaped and still retain their smooth edges. For example, we could reshape the roundness of the corners of this rounded rectangle shape. That's done in the Properties panel that popped out when we made the shape. Come down to this section of the Properties panel and hover over any of the corner icons, and then drag to the right to make the corners rounder. Because there's a highlighted link icon in between these 4 icons, all 4 corners change together. Let's close the Properties panel by clicking the double-pointed arrow at the top right of the panel, and then go to the Layers panel and click off the rounded rectangle layer onto a different layer for just a second. And as you do, take a look at the rounded corners, and you can see how smooth they are. Let's click back on the rounded rectangle layer again to see that we can also change the size of the entire shape and still retain the smooth edges. I'll go up to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform. And this time it says Free Transform Path because Photoshop knows what kind of object we have on this layer. Hold down the Shift key to constrain proportions and the Option key, that's the Alt key on Windows, to resize the shape from the center out. And then go to any of the corners and drag outward, and you can make the shape bigger. And while we're still in Free Transform, let's change the shape of this shape. I'll go to the bottom edge of the shape and I'll drag up. And then let's accept these changes by going up to the Options bar and clicking the check mark. Now, if you go back to the Layers panel and click on another layer, you can see that the edges of the shape are still smooth. Let's click on the rounded rectangle layer one more time to move the shape into place. I'll go to the Tools panel and I'll get the Move tool, and then I'll click and drag the shape using the pink Smart Guides that appear to align it to the other elements in the image. One of my favorite things about shape layers is the way that you can change the color of a shape layer on the fly. Go over to the Layers panel and double-click on the thumbnail on the rounded rectangle layer. That opens the color picker. As long as the color picker is open, when you move out into the image, your cursor changes to an eyedropper, and you can click on any part of the image to sample the color from there and automatically color your shape. Click OK to close the color picker. And you can reopen the color picker anytime the same way and choose a different color for your shape. In many ways, a shape layer acts just like any other layer. For example, you can change the opacity of a shape layer. To do that, go to the opacity slider at the top of the Layers panel and drag to the left to make the shape less opaque or more translucent. When you're ready to save an image that has shape layers, be sure to use the Save As command and save the working file in a format that retains layers, like the Photoshop or PSD format. That way, your shape layers will be available the next time you open the file so you can make changes to them. Take some time to experiment with some of the other shape tools that are located in the same place in the Tools panel, like the Ellipse tool, which you can use to make ovals and circles. Coming up, we'll explore the Custom Shape tool and discover lots of custom shapes that come with Photoshop that you may not know you have. One of the easiest ways to add an object to an image is to use the custom shapes that come with Photoshop. If you haven't discovered the custom shapes, here's how to find them and apply them. You can use this image from the practice files to follow along, or any image of your own. In the Tools panel, go down to whichever shape tool is showing at the moment, and press and hold, and from the flyout menu, select the Custom Shape tool. Go up to the Options bar for this tool, and over on the right, you'll find a Shape Picker. Click on the Shape Picker, and you'll see some icons of a few custom shapes, but there are lots more. If you click the gear icon on the right side of this drop-down panel, you'll find a long menu. From there, choose All. And that's going to bring in all these categories of custom shapes that you see listed here. If this message appears, click OK. Now go to the bottom right corner of the panel and drag down and to the right to stretch out the panel and see all the shapes that are there. My screen isn't large enough to show all of them, but there are many to explore. Since we're working on an image for a custom tailor enterprise, here's the perfect image, these scissors, and there are actually a couple scissors to choose from. I'm going to select this one by clicking on it, and then I'll click in a blank area to close the shape picker. Before I draw out a scissors shape with this custom shape tool, I'll take a look at the Layers panel, and I'll make sure that I've selected a layer above which I want the new shape layer that Photoshop will make to be created. I've got the background layer selected. I'll move into the image, and I'm going to hold down the Shift key to constrain proportions so the scissors aren't distorted. And then I'll click and drag, and I have a scissors shape. I can change the size and the position and the color of this shape. Let's change the color to white. To do that, I'll go over to the shape layer that just appeared in the Layers panel, and I'll double-click the thumbnail on that shape layer to open the color picker. And then I'll select white, and I'll click OK. To make the scissors smaller, I'll go up to the Edit menu, and I'll choose Free Transform Path, And then I'll hold down the Shift key to constrain proportions, and I'll drag in to make the scissors smaller. When I think they're just about small enough, I'll click inside of that box and drag to position the scissors where I want them, right there. And then to accept all those changes, I'll go up to the Options bar and I'll click the big check mark. I'll go over to the Layers panel and I'm going to click on a layer other than the scissors layer to see the result. So as you probably discovered, the Custom Shape tool works just like the Rounded Rectangle tool that we covered in the last video in this tutorial, as well as all of the other shape tools. The shape on this shape layer remains editable, so you can change the color, the size, the position, and more anytime you want, as long as you save in a format that retains layers, like the Photoshop or PSD format. So have fun exploring and applying a lot of the other custom shapes that come with Photoshop. Layer blend modes are a quick way to blend two images together. One of the many situations in which blend modes are useful is to add a textured look to an image. To start, open this photograph from the downloadable practice files for this tutorial, or a photo of your own. The first step is to add another image, an image of a texture. Go to the File menu and choose Place Embedded. Navigate to an image of a texture, like this one from the practice files for this tutorial, and click Place. This is just a photo that I snapped of a wall. It's a good idea to capture images like this when you happen to see them so that you have a collection of textures to work with in Photoshop. To finish placing the texture image, I'll go up to the Options bar and click the check mark. Take a look at the Layers panel. Because we use the Place Embedded method of adding an image, Photoshop automatically made a new layer for the textured photo. Make sure that new texture layer is selected. And then to apply a layer blend mode, go to this drop-down menu at the top of the Layers panel. Here you'll find a list of many blend modes to choose from. Each blend mode is a different formula for blending the colors on the selected layer with the colors on any layers below. The results depend on the images you're using, so rather than try to predict what will happen if you choose a particular blend mode, the easiest thing to do is just try them out on the images you are using. One way to do that is to just click on a blend mode in this menu to apply it. For example, we could click on the Overlay blend mode to see how it looks on this image. Photoshop is just blending the colors and tones in the texture layer with those on the background layer just below. Or we could try another one. Let's try Soft Light, which is similar to Overlay but more subtle. And you could go through clicking each blend mode in the Blend Mode menu to test it out on your image combo. But here's a bonus tip. There's a quicker way to try out different blend modes, and that's to cycle through them using this shortcut. Go to the Tools panel and select the Move tool. Then hold down the Shift key as you press the plus key, which is at the top of your keyboard. And each time you press and release the plus key, the next blend mode down in the menu is applied. And if you look at the Layers panel, you'll see the names on the layer blend mode changing as I do this. And if you want to move the other way up the menu, hold the Shift key and press the minus key on your keyboard. On this pair of images, I liked the look of the Overlay blend mode. So I'll go back to the Blend Mode menu and I'll choose Overlay. If the result is too strong for your taste, you can lower the opacity of the texture layer using the opacity slider, which is just to the right of the Blend Mode menu. With the texture layer still selected in the Layers panel, I'll drag the opacity slider to the left by hovering over its name and dragging. When you're happy with the blended result, go to the File menu, choose Save As, and be sure to save your working file in the Photoshop or PSD format. Adding texture to a photo isn't the only thing the blend modes are useful for. Layer blend modes are also a simple way to blend the content of any two images together. To practice that, let's go up to the File menu, choose Open, and navigate to another photo from the practice files. This one of some tangled yarn. I'll click Open, and then I'll add another photo to this one by going to the File menu, choosing Place Embedded, navigating to a second photo, like this one from the practice files, and then I'll click Place. And then I'll go up to the Options bar and click the check mark. Let's apply a layer blend mode to the top layer. With the Move tool still selected in the Tools panel, I'll go up to the Layer Blend Mode menu, and I'll try choosing an option from here. Or, as I already showed you, you can hold down the Shift key and click the plus key on the keyboard to cycle through different blend modes to get a different look with every blend mode. I liked the Lighten blend mode on this pair of images, so I'll go back to the Blend Mode menu, and I'll choose Lighten. You can get some really interesting blends of content on multiple images this way. So practice with some layer blend modes on images of your own. In the next video, you'll learn about another way to blend images together, and that's using a layer mask. So stay tuned. One of the most magical things you can do in Photoshop is to combine multiple objects to make what's called a composite. To follow along, open this image from the practice files, which is a photo of a sculptor's hand. To add in another photo of the sculptor's art, go up to the File menu and choose Place Embedded. Select this image and click Place. Then go up to the Options bar and click the check mark. In the Layers panel, that's created a new layer that contains just the photo of the sculptor's artwork, which is a pencil on a wood background. What we need to do is cut out or isolate the pencil from the wood. You might be tempted to do that by trying to erase the wood, but that method has a couple of downsides. To give it a try, go over to the Tools panel and select the Eraser tool. Then move into the image and click. And you get this message. Just click OK to dismiss that for now, and then go back to the image and drag to erase part of the wood. The downside of this is that if you were to save and close this image now and then reopen it, all of the pixels you're erasing would be permanently deleted. So if you're in a hurry, you may want to use the Eraser tool. But let me show you a more flexible, editable method, a layer mask. To create a layer mask, go over to the Layers panel and make sure that the Object layer is selected. Then go down to the bottom of the Layers panel and click this icon that looks like a rectangle with a circle inside it. That adds this layer mask to the object layer. At first, a layer mask is white like this, and where a layer mask is white, it shows everything on the layer to which it's attached, everything on the object layer. But let's see what happens if we add black paint to this layer mask. First, double check that the layer mask, not the image thumbnail, is selected, that it has this border around it. Then go over to the Tools panel and select the Brush tool. Go down to the bottom of the Tools panel and make sure you have black as your foreground color. If you don't, press D on your keyboard. D is for Default Colors, and that sets the default colors of black as the foreground color and white as the background color. Move into the image, press the right or left bracket keys to size your brush tip, and paint. The black paint on the layer mask hides the image on the object layer. If you paint too far and you paint over the pencil, go back to the Tools panel and click the bent arrow above the color boxes, and that switches to white as the foreground color. And then go back to the image and paint with white to show what's on the object layer, to reveal the pencil again. Here's a little rhyme to help you remember that. When you add paint to a layer mask, black conceals and white reveals. Now go back to the Tools panel and switch to black paint again. And continue to paint on the layer mask, hiding the wood, switching to white paint if you make any mistakes, and paint over the pencil. To speed this up, I'll just show you how the image will look when you're done hiding the wood. Now don't worry about getting that edge perfect. It actually would take a lot of time to do it with a mouse or a trackpad particularly. The point is to understand how layer masks work. And in the next video, I'll show you another way to do this to get a sharper edge that involves selecting an object and filling it with black rather than painting with black and white. So now let's finish this up by positioning and resizing the pencil. We'll go to the Edit menu and choose Free Transform. Hold down the Shift key hover over one of the corners, and then click, hold, and drag in to make the pencil smaller. Then move outside of a corner, and when your cursor changes to a curved double-pointed arrow, click and drag to rotate the pencil. Then move inside the boundary and drag to position it wherever you want it in the image. And then go up to the Options bar and click the check mark. Now when you save this image, be sure to use the Save As command and save your working file in the Photoshop, the PSD format, so that you retain the layers and this layer mask. Because you did use a layer mask to just hide the wood on the object layer rather than permanently erase it with the eraser tool, the object layer remains intact, and you could come back any time and fine-tune the layer mask with black or white paint, or even delete the layer mask by dragging it to the trash icon down here at the bottom of the Layers panel. And that editing flexibility is the real beauty of layer masking. Did you ever want to replace a bland or distracting image background? In this video, we'll do just that, and we'll learn more about layer masking in the process. We'll start with this photo from the practice files of an art piece by a wood artist. Let's replace its background with a more interesting shot from the artist's studio. The first step is to bring in another background image. To do that, go up to the File menu, choose Place Embedded, and navigate to this image and click Place. Go to the Options bar and click the check mark. Over in the Layers panel, there's a brand new layer with the new image. We need to drag that new layer beneath the original background layer. But we can't do that because the background layer is a locked layer. If you just wanted to unlock this layer, you could click this lock icon. But if you want to unlock the layer and rename it all in one step, then select the background layer by clicking on it, and then right-click or hold down the Control key and click if you're on a Mac, and choose Layer from Background. And in the New Layer dialog box that appears, type a new name for this layer. I'll call it Pencil, and then click OK. Now select the Replace Background layer and click, hold, and drag beneath the pencil layer. You can release your finger from the mouse or trackpad when you see a double line under the pencil layer. The next thing we're going to do is make a selection of the background, and at that point you could delete it from the image completely, but that would be a permanent change and wouldn't leave you very much editing flexibility. To do it a more flexible way, we're going to use a selection with a layer mask. To see what I mean, click on the pencil layer in the Layers panel. Go over to the Tools panel and select the Quick Selection tool. Now you could select either the foreground object or the background, so just click and drag over the background to select it. Before we apply a layer mask, we need to have the item that we want to show, not the item that we want to hide, selected. So we need to invert this selection. Go up to the Select menu and choose Inverse. Now go to the Layers panel and click the Create New Layer Mask icon at the bottom of that panel. That was a real time saver because Photoshop not only created a layer mask, it also filled in the area that wasn't selected on that layer mask with black. And where a layer mask is black, it hides the content on the layer to which it's attached, the pencil layer. Where a layer mask is white, it shows the content on that layer. On this mask, the white is showing the pencil and the black is hiding the pencil, so we can see down through to the new background layer below. If you're happy with that result, you're done. You've achieved your goal of replacing the background image. But here's a bonus option. You can try to fine-tune the mask to make it look even better. To do that, go up to the Select menu and choose Select and Mask. That opens the image with the mask applied here in the special Select and Mask workspace. Earlier in this tutorial series, we visited this workspace when we were fine-tuning a selection. Now we're fine-tuning a mask, which is very similar. First, let's click on the View menu and choose the way we'll view the image in this workspace. I'm going to choose on Layers, which will let us see exactly how the pencil will look against the new background layer as we adjust the mask. I'll click on a blank area to close the View menu, and then I'll go to the Global Refinements section of this dialog box. Here there are sliders that often work well when you're trying to isolate a hard-edged image, like this pencil. Keep your eye on this white halo along the edge of the pencil that we want to remove, as I go to the Shift Edge slider and I move it to the left. And what I'm doing is contracting the mask so that it's hiding that edge. You also can try dragging the Smooth slider to the right to smooth out the edge of that mask, and I might try dragging the Contrast slider to the right to make the edge along the pencil a little more contrasty or crisp. When you're done with the sliders, scroll down and make sure the Output menu is set to Layer Mask, and then click OK. And that modifies the layer mask that we already had applied to the pencil layer. One last thing. Notice that there's a link icon between the layer mask thumbnail and the image thumbnail on the pencil layer. That means that if we were to move the pencil layer, the layer mask would go with it. Go over to the Tools panel and get the Move tool, and then click on the pencil and drag it over to the right. Now all that's left to do is to save the image, and you want to be sure to use the Save As command and save in the Photoshop, the PSD format, so that you retain your layers and this layer mask, so that you have the flexibility to come back in the future and fine-tune your layer mask further if you want to. Photoshop comes with lots of filters that you can apply in combination to get an almost unlimited number of different looks on the same image. In this video, you'll learn how to preview and apply combinations of filters using the Filter Gallery. If you're following along, open this image from the practice files for this tutorial. We only have one layer in this image. If you're working on a multi-layer image, then select the layer to which you want to apply the filter. And then go up to the Filter menu. And if you come down to this area, you can apply a single filter from any of these categories. But let's see how we can preview and apply combinations of filters. For that, choose Filter Gallery from this menu. That opens this big Filter Gallery window, with the last filter that you used applied to the open image. So your image may look slightly different than mine. Over on the left, there's a big preview, and in the middle, there are thumbnails of filters. To preview a filter on your image, just click its thumbnail. And you'll find lots more filter thumbnails in these folders. I'll click the arrow to the left of this folder to open it, and I'll click on one of these filters. Now, even if you don't like the look of a filter at first, give it a chance, because there's a lot you can do over in the next column, where you'll find controls that are unique to whichever filter you just selected. And you can experiment with these controls. What's really special about the Filter Gallery is that you can preview combinations of filters on your image here. To add another filter, I'll go down to the bottom of the column on the right, and I'll click this Create New Filter Layer icon. You can now see that there are two copies of Diffuse Glow applied to this image. With the top one selected, I'll apply a different second filter instead. I'm going to click the arrow to the left of the Texture folder and scroll down a little and click on the Texturizer filter. With this filter, you can choose different textures to add to an image. And you have controls you can use to vary the look. Let's add one more filter to this combination by going down to the bottom of the column and clicking this icon, and then going over and selecting another filter thumbnail. Even if you don't like the look of this at first, you can go back to the filter layers where there's now a new layer and click and drag that layer beneath another filter and get a very different look. You can turn these filter layers off and on temporarily by clicking the eye icon to the left of any one. So there's how this looks without that last filter, and here's how it looks with the filter. If you really don't like one of the filters, you can delete it by selecting it here and then going down and clicking the trash icon. When you like the preview of a combination of filters, you can apply them to the image by going up to the top of this window and clicking OK. That closes the Filter Gallery window and takes you back to your main Photoshop workspace. Applying those filters has made a permanent change to this image, so regardless of the format in which you save the image now, the filters will be baked in and non-editable. If you don't like the filters, the only thing you can do at this point would be to undo. As you get better at Photoshop, you may decide to give yourself more flexibility by applying filters in a non-permanent way as editable smart filters, as you'll learn how to do in the next video. Blurring a background image is a great way to draw attention to what's in the foreground. In this video, we'll apply a quick blur to a background, and as a bonus, you'll learn how to apply any filter in a non-permanent, editable way as a smart filter. Give it a try with this image from the practice files for this tutorial. First, let's bring in a foreground image. Go up to the File menu, choose Place Embedded, and navigate to this image in the practice files, and click Place. To make this image smaller, hold the Shift key, hover over a corner, and drag inward. If you want to reposition this image, click inside of the box and drag to where you want it. And you can rotate it too by moving your cursor outside of one of the corners, and when the cursor becomes a double-pointed curved arrow, dragging the image to rotate it a little bit. To finish placing the image, go up to the Options bar and click the check mark. So that's the beginning of a travel composite. If we want to draw more attention to the foreground image, let's try blurring the background image, and we'll do that by adding a filter. Go to the Layers panel and select the background layer. Then go up to the Filter menu, and before you choose a filter, choose Convert for Smart Filters, and click OK. That changes the background layer into a special layer that will support an editable or smart filter. So let's go ahead and apply a blur filter as a smart filter. Go back up to the Filter menu and go to Blur and choose the Gaussian Blur filter. In the Gaussian Blur dialog box that opens, just drag the radius slider to the right to increase the blur, or to the left to decrease blur. With the Preview box checked, you'll see a preview of the blur in the image. If I uncheck that, you can see how the image looks without the blur, and if I check that, here's how it looks with that blur. When you're satisfied, click OK. Take a look at the Layers panel, and you'll see that the background layer has a sub-layer underneath it, and that's the Smart Filter, the Gaussian Blur Smart Filter. You can apply any filter the same way. The beauty of using smart filters is that they remain editable. So even if I were to save this file and close it, and then reopen it again, the Gaussian Blur filter would be here, waiting for me to re-edit it if I wanted to. The only thing you have to be sure to do is to save in a format that retains layers, like the Photoshop or PSD format. If you do want to re-edit a smart filter, just double-click its name here in the Layers panel, and it reopens, and you can make a change. And then click OK. So the next time you're applying a filter, think about whether you might want to change that filter, and if so, apply it as a smart filter and save in the PSD format.